I kind of subscribe to Warren Bennis's theory that, people can smell a phony a mile away. And I think that you have to get people to see you and to know you as a person, so they recognize that you're no different from them. You may have a different position than they have, but you're a human being and that person's a human being, and we need to be able to connect at that level. And there, I think, are different ways to do that. We talk about empathy and we talk about emotional intelligence, but at a fundamental level, you've got to be able to create a relationship with a person. And I think that's part of leadership development, is what is your personal style that allows you to connect with people and to engage with people, that weakens the position power argument, like I'm your boss, you're the subordinate, I tell you what to do. How do you create this kind of a relationship with a person, right? And still get this work done? Mm-hmm.
David, sincere thanks. Honored that you're here in so many ways. I hope you know that.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Agenda-wise, blank sheet of paper, going to be talking about leadership and maybe starting in the Wayback Machine. Do you remember, maybe you're a kid, or maybe it was when you were working at Merck, do you remember the first time you ever said, that person's a leader, that was leadership?
I would say, I'm thinking about my college football experience. I was a sophomore who made the starting offensive line, and there was a lineman next to me. I was a tackle and he was a guard, and he was a senior and I was a sophomore. And he was surprised that I got the starting job. I beat out a friend of his who was also a senior. And so at first I thought there was a little bit of resentment, but then I came to realize that he was all about the team, and that just because I was a sophomore and less experienced than his friend, we needed to work more closely together to make sure that we could be successful, as an O-line. Bill Hind is his name. His nickname was Butt.
For probably very obvious reasons, yes.
And Butt was a guy who I really looked up to. And I remember sophomore year, our first game of the season was against the University of Delaware, who at the time was rated the #1 Division II college football team in the nation. And we were in Gettysburg, and we played the first half reasonably well. We were down at the half, but not bad. And we went in at halftime. I was exhausted, and I laid down on the floor in the locker room next to Butt. And Butt looked over at me and he said, they have a whole nother team that they're going to put out in the second half. He said, you're not going to see any of those guys again.
Yeah,
we're getting all new guys. So
they're done.
But he was somebody who I looked up to. I really admired him because of the way he acknowledged, where I should fit in and helped me do it, which was good and unexpected.
Yeah, and so it's the whole idea of you have, and you're very aware of this, right? You've displaced somebody that he would rather be next to.
Yeah.
And then he initiated and said, okay.
He stepped up to it.
You're here, right? We're on the same team. By the way, was that the same game you walked out on the field and you were looking down the field at the Delaware game? You were going, those guys aren't so big, and we're okay here.
Yeah, and then the line came out.
And then the lineman came out. It was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, that was there's a few big guys down there, but they don't look too big. He said, wait till the line comes out.
Wait till the line. Weren't there like a couple of NFL All-Pro Redskin?
Yeah, Redskin players, absolutely.
Yeah.
2 guys. One of them, I had his cleat marks on my chest and grass burns on my back, actually.
If you had to, there's like 17 million definitions of leadership, right? But how would you define what Butt did there? How would you define, is there a definition, that you have become comfortable with, or description, of leadership?
Well, it's a bit cliche-ish because of the work that you do, but I think some of that is situational. Like, I saw Butt step up to something that he was uncomfortable with, but did it for the right reason, and said, this is what I should do, as opposed to, I resent the way this got handled by the coach. And I think I found in my work experience, you're challenged at times to do the same thing, which is step into a situation where not everybody's going to be comfortable with the thought you're bringing to the party or the decision you're going to make that's going to affect the group. So in the leadership context of that, there's a bit of a why as opposed to a how. And when you have the why clear in your mind about why you're doing what it is you're about to do, I think it's easier to step up, and even if it makes people uncomfortable, and you say, here's what we're going to do, but here's why we're going to do it. Let's make sure we got the why worked out before we figure out the what or the how.
Yeah.
And I think Butt did the right thing for the why. He was for the team. He was a team guy.
Yeah. Bigger than.
Yeah, it was, I need to do this. I need to help this sophomore out, and we're good friends to this day.
Yeah.
I mean, 40 plus years later, Bill Hind is still one of my friends.
You've obviously done a lot of leadership and had that sort of courage and managed a number of those moments throughout your career. But you're also, uniquely qualified to talk about leadership development from a training standpoint. Are those moments and are those things trainable from your perspective? What is the value of training leaders in organizations, as opposed to just, trying to find during the hiring process somebody that has those qualities or those characteristics and then introducing them?
I've always been of the persuasion that it's easier to train management skill than it is to train leadership. And I don't say leadership skill, I would just say leadership. If I back up and think about learning to become a manager and what were the skills I needed to be an effective manager, how do I apply them, how do I get better, that wasn't leadership to me. That was really the responsibility you have for the process that you put in place to get work done. So I can sit with you and we can discuss what it is that you're supposed to be doing, what are the resources required, what's the time frame within which you're supposed to deliver it, how frequently do you want to check back with me so we make sure we're on the right path, all around management activity. I think the leadership side of things is much more of a development over time as opposed to a 1-week management training course where at the end of the week you can demonstrate certain skills and say, okay, I may not have practiced it much yet, but I understand what I'm supposed to do to get this work done. And I think the leadership part of it for me was much more of a journey. I didn't really consider leadership, in the way I think about it now. When I first became a manager, I was much more of a task-focused person. And I was managing to get stuff done. I was probably a bit abrasive as a manager at times because I was so focused on an endpoint, and if somebody couldn't get there at the speed with which I thought we should get there, and they would be taken aback a little bit. And I think part of me learned in leadership that that's not necessarily a great management style. It might be for some people, but you lead other people differently than that too, right? So some people that works with, some people that don't. When you recognize that, that's a leadership skill.
Yeah.
It's a leadership learning. I don't know if it's a skill, but Sam is a racehorse. I need to run him fast and pat him down when I get him back to the barn. Joe is not a racehorse. I need to coax him and get the thing out and swat him a couple of times and, show him that I love him and I support him and we got to get that done, right? So I think that's more of a development from a leadership perspective. And over time, there are a lot more experiences. I think that you begin to see yourself differently. I think my view of myself as a leader was I started to see myself differently. And it came through, sometimes the wrong kind of interactions with people. Where I made people very uncomfortable. And when they had the courage to tell me, and I didn't realize it, that I was doing what I was doing, step back and you say, whoa, I need to be much more self-aware, right? I need to be much more empathetic. I need to be self-deprecating to some degree to be able to connect differently with different kinds of people. And that was really when I started to change my style. That was in the Astra Merck days, I would say to you. I had already managed a bunch of stuff within the Merck organization. I think that task focus was probably very much a Merck kind of cultural trait. And, as we were creating a new organization, we were trying to create a different culture. And that different culture just required a different approach to things.
Yeah. Well, and you came in on the commercial side, right? As a sales rep, that was your first
Yes.
your first job. Why did you get promoted? And I'm assuming your first promotion was to DM, or did you take a rotation inside?
I took a rotation inside.
Okay. In that kind of culture that you described, that was heavy on task, and by the way, Merck wasn't much different than anybody else back in that era. But how did you get promoted? Why did you get promoted? What was the rationale for, here's somebody that's been doing this for a while, let's move them into this position where they're in charge of people.
Yeah.
What qualified you?
I think the very first thing that gets attention is good performance on the sales line. So as a sales rep, both as a regular rep for a couple of years and then in hospital territory for a couple of years, I was very successful with introducing new products in the hospitals, an antibiotic where we weren't expected to do well, fighting up against Lilly, who was at the time, the leader in injectable antibiotics in the world, and we came out with a product, and I had NYU and Bellevue Hospital in New York, and Lilly had a stronghold there, and we were able to establish our product there in a couple of months and, had tremendous sales. And so all of a sudden, I think the region manager saying to the district manager, what's this guy doing at Bellevue? Like, what's going on? How come he's more successful than some of our other people? So I think that gets some attention. And then the answer to the question about, well, why is he more successful, is something that a manager is better equipped to answer than a rep, right? Like, you're out working thinking, I'm ambitious. I hope I get a chance to do something else. But as I've always said in every job I ever had, I need to do this job really well. Whether I like it or not is not the question. Can you be the best at what you're doing even if you're not crazy about the job? I love being in sales, so it was something that was one of my sweet spots, I think. But I think it got some attention, and they liked the way I was doing things, which was ethical and honest and straightforward. I think I became very, very knowledgeable about the competitive products, so that when I was engaging with a physician about an antibiotic they might select for a certain type of patient, I could discuss my competitors' products as well as my own to be able to engage in that conversation. And I think, that kind of thing was probably above and beyond what some other people were doing. So, and I didn't do it for that reason. I did it because I needed to do it to be effective in a place like NYU, in Bellevue, where, the residents are at the top of their learning. This is medical school now, residency, fellowships. These are really, really intelligent people. You've got to be able to engage them at their level. So I think that probably was the first thing that happened. And then I went inside for a year. I was in that rotation program. It was really a management training program. And the guy who was in charge of all of the inside stuff liked me, Dr. Elliot Margolis, and recommended that I become a district manager. And I ended up in Chicago working for Ed Fitzpatrick.
Describe your first struggles as a manager. Like, where did they come from? I'm assuming you had a few. You were promoted or sort of made a name for yourself because you were really technically proficient, in comparison to your peers. And that's kind of the age-old way of who are we going to put in this rotation? It's like, well, at least somebody that's really doing their job well. But when you showed up after the rotation and you took over your district, first formal management position, what were the nature of any struggles that you may have encountered? What advice, I guess, would you have for very technically proficient people that are now going to be managing people for the first time?
One of the things about the Merck organization, and you and I have talked about this before, is there was a tremendous focus on training. So during the time I was in that rotational year, a little over a year, I attended the management training programs for district managers, even though I wasn't a manager. So I was learning the interviewing skills process. I was learning the performance management process. I was learning the project management process that was being taught to district managers, so that when I was appointed a district manager, I at least had the basic skills of what was expected as to how you're supposed to manage at Merck. Here's the performance review process, here's the quarterly review process, here's the, and that really helped me out a lot in terms of engaging as a manager. I would give you two examples of early struggles. One of them was hiring someone who wasn't the right person for the job. And it was the first person I ever hired. And I couldn't reconcile it. You know, I used to put my calendar together for the month on how much time I would spend in the field. And I would send it out to all of my reps so they know where I was every day. And over the first few months, I was spending more and more time with this particular person. And, you know, it was the age-old self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I hired him, I'm gonna make him good. And I'm gonna make him good by spending more time with him. And so I was out working with one of my executive professional representatives, 25-year veteran in the field, extremely skilled at the highest level of a sales rep, who sat me down at lunch one day and said, you know, a few of us have been talking, like, you know, you're not spending enough time with us because you're spending all that time with this guy. And, you know, he's probably not gonna make it. And you're really missing an opportunity to go to your strengths, which is most of the rest of the district, rather than focusing on your weakness, which is this guy. And you got to help us with that, because you're good when you're out with us. You know, we learn things, you know, it's great, but you're spending less time with us. Like, why are you doing that? And I thought there was a very interesting, you know, idea of how I should be thinking about how I spend my time and how willing am I to step up to a mistake I made in hiring. And I went in to talk to my region manager after that. And I said, listen, I don't think this guy's gonna work out. He said, oh, I knew that a couple months ago. He said, I was waiting for you to get there, and I'm glad you got there. And I thought to myself, you know, first of all, I thought, well, why didn't you say something to me? But, you know, in retrospect, I realized, you know, the job of the region manager is to make sure the district managers learn their job well. And one of the things you got to learn is, do I have the right people on the bus, and how do I get them aligned with each other? But, you know, I would say that was one. And the other thing was, I mentioned earlier, I was a very task-oriented guy, and there was a particular guy in the district who had never been, he was a 20-year plus guy. He was not an executive rep. He was still a regular rep after 20 years, which is unusual. He never had a performance rating above good, but he never had fair or poor. I look back a few, just good, good, good. And I would go out and work with him, and he was very perfunctory, just doing the job in his territory on the northwest side of Chicago, calling on people, rotely going through the presentations. And I started pushing him. I just said, you know, like, you got to do more. You need to, like, we need to get better at presentation skills. You need to cover more doctors per week. We need to, and I was pushing. And, you know, I wasn't trying to push him out. I really was just thinking I could push his performance up through, you know, riding him a little bit. It was probably not as much coaching as it should have been at the time. And I ended up getting assigned to go to an assessment center for a week as an assessor. It was outside of St. Louis in Earth City. We called it Dirt City. And it was one of the most intense weeks I had ever had as a district manager. We were on from Sunday morning until Friday night, doing assessments, meeting afterwards with the management team that was there for the district managers, talking about every single person, what we assessed, differentiating between intent and behavior. Don't tell me what you thought he was going to do. What did he do? Like, let's talk about and it was just a week where I was exhausted, and I got home that Saturday afternoon from Dirt City. We were living outside of Chicago, and my phone rang, and it was this rep who called to tell me he was resigning on a Saturday afternoon. He just called and said, I'm resigning from the company. And I said, geez, you've been with the company for 20, 25 years. Why are you resigning on Saturday afternoon? He said, I just want you to know I'm resigning. And he said, so now you know. And so I hung up the phone. I called my region manager, and he said, we can't let him resign from the company. And I said, well, I said that to him, but he's not. He said to me, do you know where he lives? And I said, yeah. He said, come pick me up at my house and let's go to his house. And we went to his house and parked the car and walked up the back steps. And he was sitting in the middle of his living room. There was nothing in there but a lounge chair with pictures of his daughters and his wife all around, and he had a gun sitting on the table next to him, and he was going to commit suicide.
Wow.
And Ed and I talked him into the car. We took him over to the Loyola University Psychiatric Center, which we happened to cover, right? So I knew exactly where it was, and he was admitted. And he was in the hospital for a month or two for therapy and treatment. And when he came out, he called me and said he was prepared to retire. Not resign, retire. And so I said, let's get together for a cup of coffee and just talk about all this. Your territory's open, you just got out, you could retire next month if you work for him. He said, just meet me for a cup of coffee. So I met him for a cup of coffee, and I'll never forget it. I said, I made this offer to him, like, why don't you just come back for a month or two and see how you feel about it, you know? And he said, no, he said, I'm gonna retire, and you know, I don't ever wanna have to work for a person like you again. That's what he said to me. Back to my point of several minutes ago, which is just, I learned something about myself. I learned something about how to better deal with people and to try to understand circumstances better. And as I had learned the circumstances of his life in that relatively short period of time before he called me, I realized like his whole world had collapsed. And I never knew any of that, because when I was working with him, I wouldn't ask him questions about that stuff. You know, I'd ask him questions about product information and, you know, routings and territories and how many calls can we make today by 6 o'clock. And when he retired, and I went in to talk to my region manager, Ed Fitzpatrick, about it. Ed said to me, did you learn something there? And I said, oh my God, yeah. And he said, remember that. Like, that's, you know, a life lesson, and we were fortunate that we did what we did that Saturday night.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that comes to mind here is it's kind of surprising, given the givens, that would be, you know, what this gentleman would have to say to you. In terms of what you learned, what advice would you give a manager or anybody that's in a leadership position? There are things that go on in people's personal lives that, you know what? I mean, you know, to me, the first thing I think about is like an HR deal here or something. Mm-hmm. But what advice would you give on the basis of that, and I'm sure many other experiences? Well, we got to hit the number, right? That's why we're here. It's about success. But there's also this investment, you know, that we make in people, okay, to build the T word, right? Because it's all about trust. What would you have done differently? What advice would you have for somebody that was leading? And if they're leading a group of 12 people, there's you know, statistically, there's probably somebody that's going through something, you know, that's highly personal in nature, that rocks their world, that absolutely impacts their performance on the job.
Yeah.
Not that there's an answer in the back of the book, but what advice would we have for those people?
You know, the three words are pay closer attention, not just to the work, but to the person. Mm-hmm. I think you said it a moment ago, hey, we've got a goal we have and we need to achieve that goal, and here are the things we need to do to get there. But pay attention to the fact if someone's distracted or they're not really intent on getting to that goal and you don't know why. Mm-hmm. And I think in retrospect, I would say I thought it was easier to not pay attention to the personal side of things. Mm-hmm. I think it was easier to just stay focused on the task at hand and say, listen, I pay you X, and that X means you're supposed to deliver this result, and I'm here to help you do it. So let's figure out how we're going to get that result, as opposed to, is there something impeding this that has nothing to do with your skill level, mm-hmm. right? And all of a sudden it's about, yes, there's something else going on, in which case you then pay closer attention, get more of a balance and understanding something about the person and the people.
Yeah.
Recognizing that you both know that you're there to get the task done.
Yeah.
If there's a question about that, then I, as a manager, have not made things clear. That's not a sales rep's responsibility if it's not clear. That's the manager's responsibility. Sam, do you understand what we're trying to do here?
Yeah.
You know, and when the answer is yes, then the smart manager will say, great, tell me what it is. I need to hear it in your words, not my words. You repeat it in your words so I know you've got it. Great.
Yeah.
But then if something's not working to help get that person there, then you might want to consider what else is there. And at the time, I didn't think that was very important. I learned it was really important, but.
Comparatively, right, it's such a mess. Like, if you're there to manage, right, and there's a number of doctors and a number of presentations and competitive products and what are you saying here and what are you saying there, and I'm here to give you feedback on how well you do this orchestrated thing that you've been trained to do. Boy, is that different than sort of diving off over into Lord knows where this is going to go. And to me, that is the courage that's associated with leadership, and it's kind of where managers turn into leaders, or at least have the opportunity to to do that. But that, I think, paints a very distinct picture of kind of these two things.
Yeah.
If you know where you're going, right?
Yeah.
That's management. If you have no idea, that's more leadership, right? That's more like, okay, so what is the?
Yeah.
But having those discussions and that kind of exchange, that builds a life. Let's talk about trust and accountability. What advice would you have for people in positions of leadership coming off of this story? How do you build trust? Is there something you do to build it? How do you develop that with people? How long does it take? That any sort of advice that you might have on the T word.
Yeah. I kind of subscribe to Warren Bennis's theory that, people can smell a phony a mile away. And I think that you have to get people to see you and to know you as a person, so they recognize that you're no different from them. You may have a different position than they have, but you're a human being and that person's a human being, and we need to be able to connect at that level. And so, and there I think are different ways to do that. And we talk about empathy and we talk about emotional intelligence, but at a fundamental level, you've got to be able to create a relationship with a person. And if people work for you, then you've got to have a relationship with them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be personal. It needs to be at a level they would like it to be at, such that you believe that they will do what you ask them to do, that they, even if it's a little off the path, they trust you that you're giving them something that needs to be done that, wasn't necessarily in their wheelhouse, or they didn't think it was. And I think that's part of leadership development, is what is your personal style that allows you to connect with people and to engage with people, that weakens the position power argument, like I'm your boss, you're the subordinate, I tell you what to do. How do you create this kind of a relationship with a person, right? And still get this work done. And that is a challenge. When you say what advice, the advice is self-assess as to how you're connecting with people. And if you're doing it more from a parent-child point of view, as opposed to I'm your boss, but I'm here to work with you to help us get stuff done, because we got to get it done. Because if you don't get it done, I have a problem, right? As opposed to you have a problem because my boss expects me to get that done through you, right? So there's an element of that I think is really important. And just to reflect back on the other story for just a minute, where I said to you it was easier to not pay attention to the personal stuff. Some of that was training, and I'll throw you back to the Ferd Fournier days, where Ferd's training was very much, this is all about task and get it done, right? And so, and in retrospect, that was very, very good from a management perspective. It wasn't necessarily good from a leadership perspective.
In trying to piece, a lot of this stuff together here, like people say, to effectively lead, you have to have trust. Okay. Well, if you don't have trust, how do you get it? Well, you effectively lead. It's sort of like, if there isn't something where you get to see me in action, and I think a big part of what you're saying is you got to be genuine, right? Here's who I am, right? I'm up for feedback. And I hope you are, because I'm going to give you some. But there's this whole genuine piece to it. But we're doing something together, right? And whatever this is, that is the basis of how we're going to form trust. We value this, and we're going to get it done. I get back to but with you. It's kind of like, regardless of what I would have thought or who I would have chosen, we got to play Delaware. And you're going to be on the side of me. And if we have any success there, or any hope of success, we're going to need to be on the same page to figure this out. So where does the whole idea of accountability come into this sort of discussion, right? So there's the part where you got to pay more attention to the personal side of things, and that really provides you with a significant number of dividends when it comes to people telling you the truth about where they are, what's going on. You're acting genuine, so that endears them to. How about accountability? And how about the people, or have you ever experienced this, people that are so interested in developing trust that they don't hold people accountable? So it's that sort of dynamic. As I say the term accountability.
I have seen many times managers don't hold their people accountable because they want to make the decisions. And so somebody who works for them almost gets absolved of their accountability. They get indemnified because they have to ask their manager everything, right? And we would say, well, is that a good management style? Is that a bad management style? It is a style, and people employ it. And it tends to, and the organization, I think in a large organization, people would love to push accountability up. So I'm not accountable. My manager is the accountable person. He told me I should do this or I shouldn't do that, as opposed to I took the accountability myself for deciding I should do this and I'm not going to do that. And then checking with my manager to make sure he knows that's what I'm doing. And that's a fine line, but it's a really important one. And I guess it is easier to move away from accountability as a manager to, try to create a tighter personal relationship and trust. But I don't think you're doing your job right. I think you have to have a balance. And I think, we had lines of accountability. We have delegations of authority. Delegation of authority was what decisions were you allowed to make? Biggest one was always about money. How much money am I allowed to approve before I have to go up and ask another level for, a level of approval? And there was a delegation of authority issue, which, when I took over as CEO of AstraZeneca, and I worked for the CEO for almost 6 years on his management team, I got into that office, and in the first few weeks I was in the job, I was absolutely surprised, and I can honestly say this, I was really surprised at how much the rest of the management team that I was on asked me for advice as the new CEO, because they used to ask the old CEO and he would give them advice. He would tell them what to do. He liked that role. And I was exactly the opposite. I was like, what are we paying you all this money for? What are you asking me for an operations decision? I'm not an operations guy. You're the operations guy.
Yeah.
Like, you make that decision. And one of the first things I did, absolutely true story, was I wrote a note to our chairman and said I would like to change the delegations of authority the board had given to the CEO. Because the delegation of authority was relatively small. It was in the $5 million range on a multi-billion-dollar budget. So above 5 million, I have to go to the audit committee to get approvals for stuff. And I said, I need a grant of authority of like $50 million. I mean, I can't be asking the audit committee to review stuff at 7, 8 million. This is crazy. And my chairman agreed with me, and it went to the finance committee for discussion, the audit committee, at the next board meeting. And they said that they were willing to increase my delegation of authority. And then one of the board members said, but you're not going to increase the delegation of authority to the rest of your people, are you? And I said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Like, I'm trying to push accountability down into the organization, and one of the markers for that, one of the things that people follow, is the grant of authority. What am I allowed to do? There were other things about hiring and all, but everybody followed the money. It was like, well, how much am I allowed? So I was like, take me from 5 to 50, I'm going to move my direct reports from 500,000 to 10 million, so that they are then accountable, and they're not going to come and ask me, can I spend this $5 million? No, you're accountable for that, right?
Yeah.
And I believe there are markers in an organization around accountability that people follow. And it's not necessarily written in the rule book. It is cultural, it is, it's symbolic. I think symbolism on this is really important. Who am I holding accountable? Do a town hall with your head of operations and tell everybody he's in charge.
Yeah.
You guys think I'm in charge? Let me tell you something. He's running operations.
This is
he's
the
your
person.
guy.
This is
like he's my guy, and he's your guy. He's the guy. You know,
she is the that's the person.
That's the accountable person, and again, that's a delegation, right? You do that publicly, and everybody goes, "That's a symbolism." That's symbolism in this company. Like that means the CEO, who we think is at like this level, thinks our boss, who we think is at this level, is really like this way with him. And maybe I need to get a little bit more aligned with that guy, you know, as opposed to impress the CEO that I'm a good operations person.
Yeah, it's interesting too, as you describe it, because we kind of jumped from down here to up here. How much different is leadership? When you get to the point where, you know, you're going to influence somebody, you're going to make a decision, how much different is it at the base of an organization from like the C-suite? Okay, in terms of the way we go about it, the way we make the decision, the way that we implement the decision.
So, you know, this is an evolution for me, and I can now look in retrospect at what I did or didn't do at times. So I think at the highest level in the organization, after a couple of years, I realized I liked to manage. So I had everybody that worked for me have a set of objectives. I would sit with them quarterly or every 4 or 5 months, go over how are we doing toward these objectives. I really thought the management process is very important from a leadership perspective to make sure they know that we're having a discussion not about why we do stuff, but what are we doing and how are we getting it done? Like, are you going to deliver on these results that you and I agreed at the beginning of the year? You know, that's what we're going to do. And I kept that. I thought that was important. But the thing that I changed was my contract with you as a C-suite person, which is, I don't really have a lot of room for stuff not getting done. You know, like you're accountable for this part of the organization and you have to deliver on it. And if it's not going to happen, if I have to tell you that it's not happening, then this is a bad relationship. You need to be able to tell me something's not happening and we'll figure out what the implications of that are. But in the end, this is a really short string for me. Like if you're not getting the job done, I got to get somebody who can. I'm not in the rehab business at C-level. Like I'll coach you, I'll hold you accountable for work, but in the end, it's on you. And when it's on you, you need to come to me when you're feeling it's heavy on you and you need some advice, you want to make me aware of something, that's really important, right? Because then we can have a conversation about it. Because if I have to bring it to you, then that's not good at all.
Yeah.
You know, then you're missing the beat somewhere. Your sensing mechanisms aren't working. Mine should never work better than yours in your organization. You know, if I know stuff about your organization, you don't know about stuff that's not getting done. Like that's not good if you're not telling me, right?
Yeah.
And I think that farther down in the organization, that's not necessarily the case, you know. So I think
more string, more, runway.
It's more. Then there's more management.
There's more mistake. We can recover.
I can coach. Let's talk about this. What do we need to do to get through it? You know, how much tolerance do I believe? You know, that I've got my binary approach to management, which is willingness and ability. You know, ability is skill and willingness is coaching. Like and if you can do something but you don't want to do it, I got a problem and I need to figure out why, because I don't have to put you through training. I need to figure out, here's the box on the organizational chart. We need this kind of work out of the box. Are we getting that kind of work out of the box right now? No, we're not. Well, funny, let's take you out of the box for a minute and just talk about the box. Do you believe that that box should deliver this kind of work in our organization? Because that box comes to me and I think that's what this box should do. Well, yeah, it probably should be. Well, and you and I both agree now you're not doing that kind of stuff in that box. You're doing something a little different than that, huh? Yeah, so let's talk about that, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, in the organization, you spend more time trying to figure out, if I'm going to correct this, what's the investment required to do it? Because it's a significant investment to cut a person loose, try to recruit someone and then bring them in and train them to do the job. That's significant, just financially. You know, people will quantify it. I can't quantify it. It's all about distraction. It's all about how much time you spend doing stuff. I mentioned to you earlier today, one of the best things I was able to do, at this board I'm on is hire a good CEO because, he has taken the reins and responsibility for that company, which is great. So it's, it's the same kind of thing. It took a while to get there, but, the distraction and everything else that went on ahead of that was crazy in terms of time invested and what you had to do. And then all of a sudden, poof, it's clear I got something that works. And if you think you can get somebody fixed, if you can coach them to the right spot that they can then do the job the way you want it done, that's a much better outcome if you take the time to do it. But at the C-suite, I don't know, it's a little different.
Yeah, so there's kind of strands of similarity, but the dynamic, it's far more transparent, right? It's like you're in this job, this is what you're responsible to do, and if you're not doing it, it's just kind of a foregone conclusion, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this, but I'll never forget it. But I think it was like the week before you took the big job. We were together. And we were walking along and you said, like the life expectancy of a new CEO is like 6 months.
Yeah.
Remember saying that?
Yeah, I know. I remember, yeah.
So it's kind of like, I was going, was it 6 months? What do you, like, really? Like, wow.
Yeah.
I
just read you a CEO obituary today, by the way, which was 6 months.
Yeah.
He lasted 6 months, that guy. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, but and you were 6-7 years, or
going on almost 7. 6.5, 7 years. Yeah.
So you obviously figured that whole thing out. But what I wanted to say to you, when did you know? When in your career, when did you say, you know what, I think I could play at that level? I mean, somewhere between a hospital in New York someplace, and what was going on when you sort of started, and maybe you thought that from the minute you were hired, but when did you kind of come to grips with the whole idea of, I kind of get this. I understand this. I think I can play there, and that's something I want to do. Was there a moment in time, or was there a series of things, or?
It was an incremental path in my thinking to where I concluded that I might do that job if I got the opportunity, if I was given the opportunity. And the first realization of it came when I took over the North American business as the CEO of North America. And after a couple of years in that job, where I was on the staff, right, I was on the management team of the CEO. So, I got to see how things were being done. We met every month for a couple of days. So spent a lot of face time with the CEO. You didn't see all the problems. You had a significant sampling of the kinds of things at a corporate level as opposed to at a division level, which, quite frankly, I was dealing with. I said to you a few minutes ago, a lot of stuff I dealt with, I never took to the CEO. I just took care of it. I handled it. It was my responsibility. That's why I said to you before, I was so surprised when I got into that job and saw what it was, these guys are senior people in the C-suite bringing me stuff. I'm like, that's not, like, I would never have brought that to Tom. As when I was running North America, I wouldn't have brought that to the CEO. That's my accountability to fix. If I don't fix it, he's going to hold me accountable. So it was the combination of having that kind of experience running the North American business and being part of the management team that a few years into running North America, Tom didn't do quarterly review. He just once a year sit you down and do like his view of the performance appraisal. And he was a guy who, if he was successful, he was going to have a 7, 8, 9 year run. So it wasn't like I'm thinking, I got the US job, now I'll go get that job. But a few years into it, he said to me, over the next year, we ought to consider whether or not, someday I'm going to leave this job. If you'd be interested in it, you'd have to, it's personal sacrifice. It's a really hard job.
Yeah.
He said to me, you have no idea. So he said, yeah. And I didn't when I took the job. I thought I did till I got the job.
I don't know if you remember this, but I certainly do. Again, is like we were looking at each other over an adult beverage in a pub in London somewhere, and you said to me, Sam, I had no idea how hard this was going to be. And I remember feeling the enormity, of just like how big that kind of job is for somebody that really cares.
Yeah.
I suppose for somebody that didn't really care, it's kind of a different thing. But talk about that a little bit. Just some of the unforeseen stress, the things that you just were blindsided by that were like, oh, wait a minute, this is, I got to take care of this. Like, hold on. What surprised you, when you got to CEO of?
Well, I mean, and I said it to you that day in that pub, and I'll say it again, it's an enormous job, and it can be all-consuming. You can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you would never accomplish all of what you say to yourself, this is what I really want to be doing or need to be doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, an example of that was a strategic decision that the board had allowed the prior CEO to make, which was we were not going to invest in biologics. We were going to be a small molecule company going forward, and we might license in some biologics, but that's not going to be a main part of our R&D platform and our commercial platform going forward. And that was really a European kind of decision. Our CEO was a European and he was based in England. I ran the US business, and while he saw it and understood it to some degree, in the late 1990s, biologics were really just coming into their own, and it started in the United States. And it wasn't happening in Europe. Europe was slow to adopt the biologics, primarily because of the cost, not because of the effect that they had. But one of the things I felt, all along, and certainly discussed it with the board when, they asked me if I wanted to be the CEO, is I felt we needed to have a biologics platform. That was a future technology that the company should have an investment in, and a significant investment. And the board agreed with that. They kind of looked, you think now it's 2005, 2006, we've got 5-6 years of biologics experience in the US, and you've got some European markets that are stepping up to it now and saying, we got to have drugs like Humira available for our people because it alters disease. It's not just treating a symptom. This changes the path of a disease. These are significant advances in medical treatment. And if we're going to be a leading pharmaceutical company, a biopharmaceutical company, we got to be doing that stuff. You can't say, well, we'll let that go and we'll keep treating symptoms when you can change disease. And so over the course of that first year I was in that job, we did a lot of work to try to figure out, were we going to make it or buy it? Should we create our own biologics division and start to build it and hire people and spend capital and put up, reactors and buildings, or should we find a biotech company? And we ended up buying two. And it was the most significant thing I did in the 7 years, in terms of strategy that I was, the CEO for. And now to the point you asked me about the start of it all, I never expected the kind of blowback I got internally and externally for shifting the strategy of the company, 45 degrees, not 180 degrees, but it wasn't 1 degree, it was, we're going to be in biologics and we're going to buy in. It's expensive buy, but it'll take 20 years to build it. We don't have 20 years because this market's going to run. And for the whole time that I was in the job, my research and development organization of AstraZeneca resented the fact that we had bought the biologics business, isolated it, and instead of increasing the R&D budget, I started paring down the small molecule budget and moving some of that money over to biologics. So it wasn't that we increased the R&D spend from $4 to $5 billion. We kept it at $4 billion, but if you were in the small molecule side of things, your world was getting smaller because we were investing more in biologics. So had a whole resentment internally that I was constantly dealing with. Had a commercial organization that couldn't, when's biologics coming through? We spent a lot of money. When are the biologics? We need new stuff. We don't have any new drugs, And the market, hated me for it because we had a $4 billion share buyback program going because we couldn't invest the money in anything else. So we were giving it back to shareholders. And we spent $14 or $15 billion to buy into biologics, which was a couple of years of buybacks, and we kept the $1 billion buyback anyhow. That's how much cash we were generating to be able to make those kinds of decisions. But that strategy is a 10 to 15 year strategy. It's only playing out now, right? Pfizer made a run at AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca held up the shield, and the shield was their biologics business. This is going to be worth $40 billion by the year 2023. And that's, half of it was diabetes stuff, but the rest of it is all cancer drugs, asthma drugs, all biologics. And so that's how long it takes for the strategy to play out, which you couldn't explain that to investors. I could never say we're kind of going to decrease that spend and increase this spend. It's, they're much shorter term. So. Yeah. So making a strategic decision that you believe is the right thing to do, that the board supported, although it cost more money than we thought it was going to cost at first. But, but I think in the end, take a look at the company now. It's very well positioned in the biologics future, which is really important because the small molecule business has significantly declined, right, because of generics. So, but stuff's coming at you constantly. Nobody walks in and says, wow, everything is great. When they darken the door, like, can I have 5 minutes? It's not 5 minutes. And it's not because they want to tell you everything's great.
You're anticipating.
When your general counsel comes in and shuts the door, says, we have a problem in China. I said, well, I heard part of that story. He said, well, here's the rest of the story. And he walks out, and the head of commercial walks in 2 minutes later. I know the general counsel was just in here talking about China. Let me tell you something about China. It's like the exact opposite of what the general counsel thinks we should do as to what the head of commercial thinks we should do, because everybody agrees we have a problem in China. How do you resolve that problem?
What do we do? Yeah. There comes a time when you ascend as far as you did in a corporate position, where you're perceived differently. People treat you differently. You're no longer, you're now. How do you handle that transition?
Organizational behavior, it's that old story. You ask for the time, and the one line you always hear is somebody goes and builds you a watch. But when you're the CEO and you ask for the time, there are subgroups that go out. What does he mean by time? Do you think he's talking about the time we're in now or a future time? You think he's talking about the time on the watch? So it gets very convoluted very quickly when you realize you asked a question and the organization marches off to try to create the very best answer. And after that happens once or twice, you realize you need to be very careful about what you ask for and how you ask for it, to make it very, very clear that you don't want 3 subgroups going off to discuss the concept of time. Like, all I want is, is it 10:15? Yeah, because I got to make a phone call,
Yeah.
And I think you need to have a few examples where it went haywire that you can show the organization, geez, that's not what I expected to happen. Like, I know you guys want to please me, but let's make sure we're clear on how much resource we should put behind this if I say there's something I think we ought to do. As I said to you a minute ago, the other part of that is being careful about what you ask for versus what you can get yourself without creating a whole subculture of, we've got a group of people who do nothing but answer questions for David. That's a wasted resource. So, I think that's part of it. I also would say to you, some of that's organizational behavior, and it's hard to stop because maybe with the people that you work most closely with, for example, my executive team, my C-suite, I think they all understood me. After a little while, you get some leveling, and then, okay, we get it. Like, he's, we don't have to go marching off to Versailles to, see Marie Antoinette. This is a pretty basic discussion. But farther down in the organization, it's not necessarily the case. People are spooked. It's like the CEO's coming, we need to paint. I remember being in Brazil. I went to one of our packaging plants, and they were, really excited to have me there to see me. But when I walked in, I could smell the paint. Like they had just painted the walls because I was coming, and it needed to be, fresh paint. And I remember leaving, and the operations guy, I get back, and David Smith says to me, how'd it go down there? I was like, David, I don't know what you tell these people to do. Like, they don't need to paint the walls. Because he said, did they paint that place? I said, yeah. He said, well, it needed to be painted, but it should.
You were a good excuse to get the paint.
I'm just saying, it's that kind of thing as people want to, do that. And to some degree, actually, it's good to let them do it because they feel good about it. They feel like they did something, and, the CEO was here, and he enjoyed his visit, and he learned a few things as opposed to
Love to paint.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and some CEOs take the position, they go in, all they want to do is business reviews. Let's ask questions about strategy. How many people do we have? Can we, reduce the headcount a little bit? How about expenses? What's our operating line here? What's a 5% cut look like? What would we be giving up? Like, you can do all that stuff, but I always felt that was the responsibility of the C-suite. That's not my job. Like, I can do that. I know how to do it. I did it for a living for a while, but I thought that's what I held my people accountable for. I set a target, like we're going to have, we need to have 9 to 10% sales growth, and we need to have 15% earnings per share growth. Mr. CFO, what's that look like in a budget? It's going to look like this. And then everybody goes, oh, you're cutting my budget. I can't, I remember sitting with the head of R&D and saying, he was like, well, we're going to have to cut $100 million. I said, well, before you do that, show me how you're spending the first $4 billion. I just, run me through the $4 billion before we get to the last $100 million, because I want to be sure that's all being spent as effectively as possible. And I'd like to do it at a line item level. Like, let's really get into the details. And that's when they say, you know what, the $100 million's not a problem.
Yeah.
I got it.
Well,
because I don't want you to look at this other stuff, because this is where I got all the bones are buried.
You're too busy for this.
This is where the bones are buried.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always thought of you as a very genuine person, and you've talked about that before. Just like part of leadership is that you got to be yourself. Mm-hmm. I would think that would have been not necessarily a struggle, but definitely a transition for you, where you're perceived very differently because of your position, mm-hmm. In an organization, and you just being a candid, genuine person sets in motion, havoc. Mm-hmm. So to me, right here, you're saying is that you consciously realize that, mm-hmm. and then you're adjusting your behavior to more effectively play the role, so that all of these other things, don't take place, or you just get more used to it, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a fair amount of that, again, back to my point around, a couple of years into the CEO job in London, and my view of what my relationship with the C-suite executives should be, I kind of redirected. Like, I could be very open and candid and honest with them about anything, and to most extent, I think they would say the same about me. I think in retrospect, if you were to ask the gang that worked directly for me, mm-hmm. that I did their performance appraisals and gave them their bonuses and determined their raises and gave them feedback, demanding but fair, or fair but demanding. The word fair is there, mm-hmm. because that's how I like to see things. When we do your performance appraisal, I hope you're not going to be surprised, because we've had these conversations throughout the course of the year, And that's the same when you're a district manager and you got a sales rep and you've ridden with them 9 or 10 times. They
don't know what's coming.
That's right. Or you haven't been clear. Like, that's on me as a manager, not you as a performer. I need to make sure that you're clear. And the best thing I can do is get you to tell me what it is you think I think, mm-hmm. because then the words are coming out of your mouth, which is something that I think a lot of people miss on. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to get people to do that, because you have to wait. That's that awkward moment of silence. You say, tell me what we just talked about. Please describe it in your own words. I just want to hear it.
Spit it back to me.
Make sure we're clear.
Yeah. There's also a question I have to ask you. And I also recognize that you might not be able to just say candidly, yeah, here's everything that went on. But my understanding, you were not only like CEO of AstraZeneca, you were like president of the Pharma Biotech Association, and were actually in the room with President Obama and others for healthcare reform during his first term.
Yes.
That must have been like a wild table to be sitting around. What was that in terms of leadership and influence and all of those different kinds of things? Like, what was that like? What was, you're representing, hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
What's it like being in that room?
In the room, it was politics. It was trading. That's what it was in the room. It was how much money can the pharma organization / all the companies put on the table as offsets against the increased cost of healthcare. And that was an enormous debate amongst the members of pharma before we ever got to the White House to meet with the president and Rahm Emanuel, his watchdog. And we ended up at around $80 billion as the give over a 10-year period of time, through filling in the donut hole, some discounting that would happen at, the federal level. Like, there were 19 different ways to put together a package, but the only thing that mattered was the round number of $80 billion, which we got negotiated up to. They negotiated it up to 100. And the discussion was trade-off. It was clearly, if you guys don't bring more than that to the table, got to remember there was a supermajority. It was House was Democrat, Senate was Democrat, and the president was a Democrat, and they could pass legislation. And there was bad legislation. Importation was legislation that pharma was scared, would absolutely make a mess of things. Forcing Medicare Part D to rebates to be the same level as the Department of Defense and Veterans Administration rebates rather than done by the market. There were 3 or 4 big things that we thought as a pharma organization, the companies would cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. So we were willing to go to the table to do it. And so it was much more about getting pharma aligned on what it was we were going to go to the table to have a discussion about, because there was always some behind the scenes stuff going on that by the time you get in the room with Rahm Emanuel and Obama, they know what you're going to put on the table, and you know what they're going to ask you to do, or you have a pretty good idea and they have a pretty good idea, and then it's just a matter of getting, okay, we agree. And and I was there with just a couple other CEOs, just a few of us that went over to meet with them. What was it like? I think for them, we were just one thing to check off, because they had 24 constituencies they needed to meet with to get this done the way they wanted, right? So it was like, get in, get it done, get out, make sure we don't have bad legislation, and let's let this thing happen and see where it goes. So,
from your career as a DM in Chicago to that level, to sitting at that table, what advice would you have for leaders of the future? So people that they're starting their careers. I think it's easy, and maybe it always has been, but I think it's easy to get disheartened. When you start to think about how much effort do I want to put into this, because the world is such a mess. I mean, what kind of dent am I going to make? Like what is it? So there's even more obstacles to becoming an effective leader, than maybe there have been historically, or at least more complicated obstacles. What advice would you have, and what's your, crystal ball for the future? Where are we going? What does it look like from the standpoint of leadership and challenges and these kinds of things?
I don't think leadership will ever be displaced by the digital world. So, digital world's displacing a lot of things. I think technology is advancing more rapidly than anyone probably could have ever predicted. And I do think that will change the way work gets done, analysis, like a lot of things can be enabled through reducing the personal requirement that somebody used to have to do that, and now it can be done a different way. But I don't think any of that will replace the responsibility of leadership. I think going forward, if it's more challenging, you have to be clearer in your own mind about the why of what you're doing. You said, I could become disheartened because it's a cruel world, as opposed to, I need to really understand why I'm doing this. Like, I need to have a personal, down deep belief that what I'm doing is important somewhere to someone. That's, in the pharmaceutical business, it's about a patient. Like, you make a difference in a patient's life and you should feel good about it. Like, wow. And if you take a look at the advances in the 40 plus years now I've been in the industry, in medicine, but especially on the pharmaceutical biologic side, on the biopharmaceutical side, it's enormous. It's enormous. Products that made Merck the leading company in the late 1970s in the pharmaceutical world, Merck Sharp and Dohme, I think if those products were prescribed now by doctors for high blood pressure or depression or arthritis, you'd be sued for malpractice. The things that are available now, 40 years later, are so much of an advance technologically. But I think you have to understand why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Does it matter? Does it make a difference? You know, are you punching a clock? Are you taking a paycheck? Or do you really believe in what you're doing? And you know, I used to use this little story about the three guys in the sidewalk, right? And you know, one guy's taking bricks and putting mortar on it and putting it down on the sidewalk and doing it again, and you walk up and you say, what are you doing? He says, what do you think I'm doing? I'm putting bricks and mortar here. And you go to the guy 10 feet down who's doing exactly the same thing. And you say, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building a wall. And you go to the third guy who's 10 feet down from him and doing the same thing. And you say, what are you doing? He said, I'm building a cathedral. And you know, you have to understand the cathedral, even if you're slinging bricks and mortar every day. It's like, do I really know why I'm doing what I'm doing? And is it important? Is that important to do? Right? I think that's, you know, that's the best advice I could give anybody.
Find something where you buy into the why and just
do your best.
Attack it.
Sam, I had a job once I didn't like. And I was in the job for close to a year and a half, 2 years when I was working in Rahway. And the general manager position opened up for the ophthalmic business that was mostly in Europe, but it was based in Rahway, even though it was a European, mostly European and Japanese thing. And I knew the guy who was the general manager was resigning. He came in my office and said to me, I'm going up to meet with our boss tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and I'm going to tell him I'm resigning because I'm going to be the president of Company X, which is an ophthalmic company. And so I knew he was meeting with him at 9, so at 9:01 I went upstairs and stood outside my boss's door, his boss's door, and this guy came out and I walked in. And I said, listen, I know what's going on, can I have his job? And he said, it's a Dutch guy. And he said to me, why? I thought you loved your job, you do it so well. You're the person I count on to handle all of that. And I said, well, Joe, like, don't get confused by like how I do the work and what I think of the work. Like, you know, you can get someone else to do that. I really want to get a line job again. Like, let me get back to, you know, creating value, you know. But it was surprising. He's like, I thought you loved that job. It's like, oh my God, nothing could be farther from the truth. I do it really well.
But that's sort of a compliment, but then again, you know.
But that's the point. Nobody should ever know. If you don't particularly care for it, it shouldn't show in your work, or your performance is going to suffer.
And then find something you love doing it and go at it as you have. Let me end this pretty much the same way I started it, by saying we, anybody that'll look at this, you know, honored, you know, that you're here. But I'm also honored to call you a friend, sir.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
You are my friend.
So much
That's why
on behalf of everyone for spending the time and providing the insight.
Good. Well, thanks. This is great. It's a little bit of a walk down memory lane, and a good one at that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.